Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're doing something a little bit different.
Hmm.
We're looking at what came after World War II,
Okay.
because we all know the major battles and the big players,
Right.
but what happened next?
Yeah.
And so you were kind enough to share this really amazing historical timeline with me, that really lays out
All right.
some really interesting things.
It's an often overlooked period, right? We tend
Oh,
to think
freakish, huh?
of history as these neat chapters.
Right.
The war's over and then peace breaks out
Right.
and everything's fine, but,
Yeah, happily ever after.
well, not quite.
Yeah.
And I think this timeline really shows that the consequences
Right.
of a conflict like World War II can play out for decades.
Yeah.
It can shape things like international law, individual lives,
Right.
all sorts of things.
Right. And so let's start with Nuremberg. We've all heard of the Nuremberg trials.
Of course, yeah.
But I think when we dig into some of the details here,
Right.
it's pretty fascinating. And you actually have some excerpts here in this timeline from the actual transcripts of the trial.
Yes, some of them are quite chilling, actually.
Yeah. And one of the things that jumped out at me
Yeah.
was the testimony of Otto Ollendorf.
Right, a leader of Einsatzgruppe D, one of the mobile killing units.
Right. And he just matter of
Oh,
factly.
a detachment.
That is so striking.
The murder of,
It
he's
was
just
written on its
describing.
90,000 people.
It's bureaucratic.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
How
The venality of evil, as Hannah Arendt would put it.
Right.
It's just
Yeah, it's
almost a
shame-
job to him.
It really is.
This is what's so disturbing
Yeah,
about
it
it.
makes you wonder what is wrong with the human psyche.
Well, it underscores those psychological mechanisms,
Hmm.
right? The dehumanization, the way they
Right.
compartmentalize these horrors so they can function.
Right. They get,
It's a coping mechanism almost.
yeah. And
To deal with this level of atrocity.
then you have, on the other hand, you have someone like Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier,
Oh, absolutely.
who was,
An incredible woman, French resistance fighter, and a concentration camp survivor.
yeah.
One of the first Holocaust survivors to testify at Nuremberg.
Yeah. And her story is so powerful.
Incredibly powerful.
Mhm.
Her voice just cut through all the legal proceedings and reminded everyone what was at stake. The human cost of this regime.
Right. It's not just
Not just numbered.
others.
We're talking about real people
Mhm.
whose lives were destroyed.
Right. And so beyond.
And beyond the individual stories,
Right.
Nuremberg was also incredibly important for international law, right?
Right. So what was it about?
So it wasn't just about punishing the guilty parties, although that was important.
Right.
It was about setting a precedent
Okay.
for holding individuals accountable for crimes against humanity.
So this was really the beginning.
This was the groundwork for international justice as we know it.
Wow.
It set the stage for the trials we see today at The Hague and other international courts.
So it had an impact beyond the courtroom itself.
Oh, absolutely. It resonated throughout the world and continues to shape our understanding of international law today.
Okay, so let's move on in the timeline, and we get to the part about the sentencing at Nuremberg.
Right.
And we see everything from death sentences for people like Joachim von Ribbentrop to life in prison for Rudolf Hess, and some were even released, like Karl Dönitz. He got out in 1956.
Right. A range of outcomes.
Yeah, it seems like the court was really wrestling with how to assign guilt
Absolutely.
in this.
Because how do you punish something of this scale?
Right.
How do you even begin to measure individual culpability in the face of such systematic horror?
And that raises the question of, was it fair?
Right. Were the trials truly fair? And what about those who escape judgment altogether?
Right.
There's a lot of nuance there, a lot of gray areas.
So it's really a very complicated...
Messy.
History is messy.
Yeah.
It's not always black and white.
And this timeline really shows us that President Truman may have declared the hostilities over
At the end of 46.
at the end of 1946, but
Wasn't-
things were not
It wasn't that simple.
that simple.
Well,
For instance, the war crimes trials in Japan didn't finish until 1948,
right.
and the official end of the war with Germany for the U.S. dragged on until 1951.
Exactly. It wasn't a clean break.
Right, and then there's this incredible fact that's in your timeline.
Oh, yeah.
The last Japanese holdout soldier didn't surrender until 1974.
Incredible, right?
I mean, talk about a long shadow of war.
It's amazing, right?
It's really unbelievable.
It speaks to the power of belief
Right.
the challenges of communication,
Right.
and the human capacity to cling to a worldview,
Right.
even when the world has moved on.
So it's really a very human story
It is, at its core, it's a very human story.
about how individuals process and cope with these world-altering events.
Right, and how those events continue to shape their lives.
Exactly, even decades later.
Right.
It really shows that the war's aftermath got tangled up with the whole Cold War thing.
Yeah.
All sorts of complications.
Like when we were talking about the U.S. officially ending their war with Germany in 51.
That's right.
But a formal peace treaty to really sort everything out didn't happen until 1990.
Yeah, that's the Treaty on the Final Settlement.
Right.
And it really shows how the Cold War just added so many layers to dealing with World War II's legacy.
Right.
Germany was right in the middle of that ideological struggle.
Yeah, East versus West.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Both sides wanted control.
Right.
So reaching a real peace agreement was just super difficult.
It's fascinating how these things, years apart, are all connected.
Oh, yeah.
And Japan's path to peace had its own twists and turns. Like the Treaty of San Francisco officially ended the war for them in 52.
Right.
But it wasn't until 56 that they restored relations with the Soviet Union.
Again, the Cold War casts a long shadow.
Right.
You had those territorial disputes over the Kuril Islands.
Right, which are still an issue today.
Exactly. It all got tied up in the bigger geopolitical fight.
So signing a treaty isn't always the end of the story.
Right. Peace isn't just about paperwork.
Right.
It's about dealing with these huge geopolitical realities.
It's like the whole world was trying to figure out what the new rules were.
Exactly. And the Cold War really shaped those rules.
Huge impact on global politics, the arms race, proxy wars,
Absolutely.
all of it.
The whole world order changed.
Right.
Superpowers emerge.
New alliances, NATO, the Warsaw Pact,
Yep.
the threat of nuclear war.
It's impossible to understand the rest of the 20th century without understanding World War II's impact.
So we've got the legal stuff, the treaties, the geopolitical shifts.
Right.
But this timeline also has these moments that remind us about the human side of things.
The personal stories.
Yeah, like Stalin dying in 53. Did that change anything?
Oh, definitely. Stalin's death was a big turning point.
Right.
His successor, Khrushchev, started de-Stalinization.
Right, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality.
Exactly, and getting rid of some of the worst policies.
Yeah.
So you had some reforms in the Soviet Union,
Okay.
but it also caused tension within the communist bloc.
Interesting.
Some countries pushed back against the changes.
So even as things seemed to be settling down,
Right.
the world was still in flux.
Absolute power dynamics constantly shifting.
And in the middle of all this, you still had millions dealing with the war's direct consequences.
Right.
Like the timeline mentions the last big repatriation of German prisoners of war.
And forced labor.
Right, finally happening in 55.
Can you imagine years in captivity,
It's hard to fathom,
separated from your family?
not knowing what the future holds.
Just the psychological toll alone.
It's a reminder that for a lot of people,
Yeah.
the war wasn't really over.
Not until they were home and could start rebuilding their lives.
It really hits you how much disruption there was.
Millions of lives upended.
And then there's that amazing story from the timeline.
Oh, yeah.
The last Japanese holdout soldier, Private Teruo Nakamura,
Surrendering in 1974.
he was literally living in the past.
Didn't even know the war was over.
It's wild.
It really is.
It shows how war can shape individual lives.
Long after the fighting stops.
Yeah, for him, the war was still real.
A testament to ideology and the impact of trauma.
It makes you think about what the end of the war really means.
Right. It challenges our whole perception.
It's not always a clean break.
Definitely not.
It reminds us that history isn't just dates and treaties.
It's about the human experiences
Yeah.
that shape those events.
and are shaped by them.
Exactly. It's a two-way street.
So you have individuals like Nakamura grappling with the war's legacy,
Right.
but the world keeps moving.
Yeah.
Like the timeline mentions Emperor Hirohito dying in 89.
The last of the major Axis leaders.
Right.
It's interesting because his death really sparked debate about Japan's role in the war.
Yeah.
Some saw him as a symbol of aggression. Others saw him as a figurehead controlled by the military.
It shows how differently people can interpret history.
Especially when it comes to complex figures like Hirohito.
Right. And even as we try to learn from history,
Yeah.
new perspectives emerge.
Always.
It makes you question everything you thought you knew.
It's a process.
And of course, the timeline includes events that changed the whole world.
Like the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89.
And German reunification in 90.
Huge moments in history.
Yeah.
But the Berlin Wall falling symbolized the end of the Cold War.
And the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It felt like a chapter closing.
Right? All that ideological
Yeah,
conflict.
threat of nuclear annihilation,
And then Germany finally reunited.
resolving one of the biggest legacies of World War II.
It felt like healing the divisions of the past.
Symbolically, at least.
With those events, it seemed like the world was finally moving out from under World War II's shadow.
Yeah.
But as we know, history is never really settled.
It's crazy to think we're still finding pieces of the war today.
Yeah, the timeline even talks about unexploded bombs and mines and stuff.
Unexploded ordnance. Yeah.
Still being found in Europe and Asia.
It just shows you how long those scars can last.
Yeah, a real danger even decades later.
Definitely.
A sobering thought.
And it's not just the physical dangers either.
Right. We talked about the psychological impact, the economic hardship, the political divisions.
That all had a ripple effect.
And it went on for years.
Decades even.
Like how the Cold War played out international relations. Our whole idea of justice and responsibility.
It's all connected.
It really shows how important it is to understand the aftermath of World War II.
If you want to understand the world today, you have to understand the past.
So as we wrap things up, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listener will remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that peace isn't just the absence of war.
Okay.
It's something you have to work for.
Right.
It's a process.
Right.
A commitment to learning from what
They're
happened.
trying to build a better world.
A more just world, a more equitable world.
I like that.
It's not easy.
And this timeline really shows that,
It can be a long and complicated process,
full of unexpected twists and turns.
but it's worth it.
Absolutely worth it.
For us and for the future.
I completely agree.
We have to remember the past.
Right.
Not just to honor those who suffered,
But to understand how it shapes the present.
and to work to prevent those atrocities from happening again.
That's a great point. So to our listener, we'll leave you with this.
Okay.
What can you do to make the world a more peaceful place?
How can you use the lessons from history?
To face the challenges we have today.
Think about it.
Keep exploring this part of history.
It's complex and fascinating.
And it's part of our shared human story.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.